"Don't wear that dress, you'll embarrass us." Those were the exact words my sister said, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, her lips pressed so tightly together that they almost disappeared. She didn't even glance at me after she said it. She just turned toward the mirror on the wall, smoothing her own blouse as though her reflection required more of her attention than I ever would. I felt the air leave my chest. I don't think she realized how sharp her words landed, or maybe she did, because she didn't soften them. She didn't say them with laughter, or with the kind of teasing we used to do when we were younger. No, they came out flat, cold, and deliberate. I stood there in the same spot, the fabric of my dress clinging to my fingers because I'd been nervously adjusting it all morning, trying to decide if it was too much, too little, too old, or too bright. Now I had my answer, and it was crueler than I expected. I wanted to reply. Something sharp, something clever. But the only words that made it to my lips were a weak, "What's wrong with it?" My voice cracked, and I hated how small I sounded. She looked at me finally, and her eyes did that quick scan they always did, moving from my hair down to my shoes as though she were cataloging flaws. "It's just not right," she said, waving her hand vaguely. "You know how people talk. It'll look like you're trying too hard." Trying too hard. That phrase echoed louder than the rest. I had stood in my room earlier, holding that dress up to the light, tracing the lines of it with my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I had thought it looked beautiful. Not perfect. Not new. But beautiful in a way that made me feel like myself again. Now all I could think was how foolish I must have looked for believing that. I hung my head a little, staring at the floorboards beneath my feet, each one carrying the dust and scratches of years of living. I had been standing there in my own house, in my own hallway, and yet I felt like an intruder, as though I'd crossed some invisible boundary and needed to apologize for my presence. She picked up her purse from the table, sliding the strap over her shoulder with practiced ease. "Just wear something simple," she added, as if the conversation was finished. "Something that doesn't make people stare." And then she walked out of the house. The silence that followed was so heavy I thought I could hear it pressing against my chest. I stayed frozen for a long time, staring at the door she'd closed behind her. My hand still clutched at the fabric of the dress, wrinkling it in my grip. I let out a shaky breath, but the tremble in my chest didn't ease. I turned back toward the mirror at the end of the hall. The reflection that met me didn't look embarrassed yet, but it looked uncertain. My mouth pulled downward, and my shoulders slumped as though I'd already accepted her verdict. I hated how easily I gave her that power, how quickly her voice overwrote my own. The thing is, it wasn't just about the dress. It never is it? It was about years of comments that chipped away quietly. "You should cut your hair shorter, it would look better on your face." "Maybe sit this one out, you don't really fit in with that crowd." "Why are you laughing so loudly? People are staring." Always said with the same casual sharpness, as though she were doing me a favor by pointing out my faults before anyone else could. I stood there until the clock on the wall ticked loud enough to remind me that time was still moving, whether I wanted it to or not. I walked back into my room slowly, dragging my feet across the carpet. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, making the room glow with a soft haze. The dress I wore, pale blue, with a pattern I'd always liked but rarely dared to wear, looked different now. Smaller. Almost childish, the way clothes can shift in your perception once someone points out their supposed flaws. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed, my palms pressing into the quilt until my knuckles whitened. I could still hear her voice, and it mingled with older echoes. Times I'd been told to stay quiet, to sit at the back, to let others take the spotlight. Times I'd been reminded that I was too much or not enough. Those memories lined up neatly in my head, waiting their turn to remind me of every moment I had bent myself smaller for the comfort of others. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just a dress, just one event, just one careless comment. But the truth is, the sting spread wider. It wasn't about fabric or color. It was about being told, yet again, that my existence was an inconvenience if it didn't conform to the shapes others expected of me. I thought of saying nothing, of folding the dress carefully and putting it back in the closet, slipping into something plain and dark, blending into the background like I'd done so many times before. That would be easy. That would be safe. But the thought made something ache inside me, a deep kind of ache that wasn't just sadness but exhaustion. I was tired of disappearing. Still, I didn't move right away. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the hem of the dress, brushing my fingers over it again and again as though I could erase her words with touch alone. My chest felt heavy, my throat tight. And underneath it all, a question began to rise: why am I always the one who has to shrink? Why is it always me who has to change? I didn't have the answer yet. All I had was the weight of her words, sitting like a stone in my stomach, pressing against every old scar of silence and compliance I'd carried for years. But I knew, in that still and aching moment, that this time it would be harder to fold the dress away. Harder to erase the spark I'd felt when I first put it on. Something inside me resisted, quietly but stubbornly, and though I didn't know where that resistance would lead, I knew it had begun. I didn't leave the house that day. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe the weather was too hot, that it wasn't worth the effort. But deep down I knew it was because of her. Because of the words that were still sitting like thorns beneath my skin. I made tea just to have something to do with my hands. I watched the kettle rattle on the stove, steam rising in a thin line, and I thought about how ridiculous it was to let one sentence change the way I moved through my own home. Yet every sip I took tasted faintly of shame, as if her judgment had seeped into the leaves themselves. The quiet of the house was unbearable. It wasn't the comfortable silence I usually enjoyed, the kind where I could read a book or let the afternoon pass gently. No, this was the kind of silence that hums with accusation, as though the walls themselves were reminding me of what had been said. I found myself wandering from room to room, restless, touching familiar objects just to remind myself I still existed within them. When I reached the wardrobe, I paused. The blue dress hung inside now, crumpled from the way I had peeled it off and shoved it back earlier. It looked wounded, abandoned. I stood staring at it, hand gripping the wooden doorframe, and I remembered the moment I bought it. It wasn't expensive or particularly fashionable. But the fabric had caught the light in a way that made me feel soft, almost radiant. I had bought it for myself, not for anyone else, not for any event. Just for the quiet joy of wearing something that made me feel alive. That memory stung even more than her words. Because now I wondered if that joy had been an illusion, if my reflection had only fooled me into believing something that wasn't true. I sat down on the floor of my room, my back pressed against the bed frame. And as I sat there, old echoes began to thread themselves into the present. Times I'd been told to lower my voice at family gatherings because it carried too much. Times I'd been reminded that my choices were impractical, that I needed to think of how things looked, not how they felt. Even the small things, the way I was always gently pushed to the side of photographs, or how people would glance past me when deciding who should speak. None of it had seemed catastrophic on its own. But strung together, it formed a tapestry of quiet erasures. I don't think my sister ever considered the weight of these small cuts. To her, perhaps, they were just words, thrown carelessly like crumbs. But for me, they stuck. They lodged themselves in the tender parts of me, the ones I never showed. And each one whispered the same refrain: you are not enough. You never will be. By evening, the heaviness inside me had grown. I tried reading, but the words blurred. I tried turning on the television, but every voice grated against my nerves. I ended up lying on the couch in the dim light, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, steady and unchanging, and for some reason it made me want to cry. I thought about calling a friend, but I didn't want to hear myself say the words out loud. I didn't want to admit how deeply they had pierced me, how something as ordinary as a dress could unravel me so easily. There's a kind of shame in admitting pain over small things. People always expect the hurt to be grand, to have an obvious reason. But it's never the single blow that breaks you. It's the accumulation, the slow wearing down. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, a strange thing happened. As much as I felt diminished, I also felt a stubborn ember flicker. A part of me was tired of mourning every careless word, tired of letting someone else's opinion weigh so much more than my own. I couldn't make it big yet, couldn't make it roar, but it was there, a faint resistance humming beneath the sorrow. The next morning, I opened the wardrobe again. My hand hovered over the blue dress. I didn't put it on, not yet. But I didn't push it back either. I let it hang where I could see it. Every time I walked past, I glanced at it out of the corner of my eye, as though testing my own resolve. The rest of the week dragged, each day painted with the faint film of her words. I replayed the moment again and again, thinking of what I should have said, what I should have done. I imagined myself standing straighter, laughing off her remark, or even calling her out on her cruelty. But in reality, I had stayed silent, and that silence gnawed at me. On the third day, I decided to walk into town. I told myself it was just for groceries, but really, I needed to breathe somewhere beyond the walls that had absorbed my hurt. As I moved through the aisles, picking up bread and fruit, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of the freezer door. My posture was slumped, my expression tired. I thought about how visible pain can be, how even strangers could probably read it if they looked closely enough. But no one did. People moved past me, lost in their own errands, their own worries. And in some strange way, that comforted me. It reminded me that maybe I was smaller in the eyes of the world than I feared. That her words weren't stamped across my forehead, that I still had the freedom to choose how I carried myself. When I got home, I brewed another cup of tea. I set it down on the table and watched the steam curl upward. And I whispered to myself, barely audible, "It's just a dress." But it's also not. That contradiction hung in the air, heavy but true. I didn't know it yet, but the path forward was already shifting beneath me. Her comment had cracked something open, not just the wound of exclusion, but also the possibility of reclaiming something I had long buried. It was faint, tentative, and wrapped in fear. But it was there, waiting. And I realized, as I sat in that quiet kitchen, that perhaps this time I wouldn't fold so easily. The dress stayed where I had left it, draped over the chair like a witness. Every time I walked into the room, I could feel its presence, patient and accusing. At first, I avoided its gaze. I'd glance at the bookshelf instead, or the uneven patch of wallpaper near the window. But the dress had a way of pulling me back, reminding me of everything I'd tried to swallow. On the fourth morning, I decided I couldn't sit in the house with it anymore. The silence felt thick, and the air felt used. I pulled on an old cardigan, slipped on shoes that had seen better days, and stepped out into the neighborhood. It was early, the street still soft with the sounds of shopkeepers lifting shutters and the low hum of bicycles passing by. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and for once, that grounded me. I told myself I was just going for milk. But I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I needed to move, to remind myself that my body wasn't just something for others to judge, it was also a vessel that could carry me through streets, through sunlight, through choice. At the corner shop, I lingered longer than usual. The man behind the counter greeted me with his tired but kind eyes, the sort that always looked slightly surprised anyone had walked in at all. I picked up milk, yes, but also ginger, and then a packet of dried hibiscus I'd never bought before. On a whim, I reached for a bar of dark chocolate. It felt indulgent, unnecessary. I almost put it back. But then I thought, why not? Why was I always rehearsing apologies for the smallest things? I kept it in the basket. Walking home, I slowed my steps. The world around me moved at its own pace, a woman balancing vegetables in a cloth bag, a boy hopping across cracks in the sidewalk as though they were rivers. I felt the scarf of the morning breeze brush against my neck, and I realized how starved I had been for sensation untainted by judgment. Back in the kitchen, I boiled water, crushed the ginger, and dropped hibiscus petals into the cup. The water turned a rich, ruby red, and the scent rose warm and sharp. I sat by the window and drank slowly. For the first time in days, the act of lifting a cup to my lips didn't feel like a rehearsal for someone else's approval. It felt like mine. The chocolate was next. I unwrapped it carefully, breaking one square, then another. The taste was bitter at first, then softened into sweetness. I let it sit on my tongue until it melted completely. It struck me then how often I rushed through things, through meals, through moments, through life itself, as though speeding past might shield me from scrutiny. But here, with something as simple as chocolate, I discovered what it meant to claim time for myself. That evening, I went to the wardrobe again. The blue dress still hung silently, but this time, I touched it without fear. My fingers traced the seams, the curve of the waist. I didn't put it on, not yet. Instead, I slid hangers aside and looked at everything else I had ignored for years. There were scarves folded neatly at the back, colors I had once loved but stopped wearing because someone told me they were too loud. There were skirts with hems that brushed against my calves, skirts I'd worn in private but never dared to show at gatherings. I began pulling them out one by one, laying them on the bed. The fabric carried scents of cedar from the mothballs I'd tucked in, but beneath that, faint memories clung, laughter at a friend's wedding, a day by the sea, the first dinner I cooked in this house. I sat on the bed among the fabrics, running my hand over textures, silk that whispered, cotton that held firm, wool that scratched faintly. It was overwhelming at first, like facing a chorus of versions of myself I had abandoned. But slowly, I found it comforting. These clothes had waited. They hadn't judged me for leaving them in the dark. They simply waited until I was ready to look at them again. The next day, I went to the market. Not for groceries this time, at least not only. I wandered through stalls, touching fabrics, watching women bargain over bangles, smelling roasted peanuts. I found myself at a small stall run by a woman with a kind smile. Scarves hung like banners behind her, each one catching the light differently. I reached out to touch one, muted, river-colored, soft in a way that felt like it wanted to listen, not cling. Good fabric, the seller said, matter of fact, not as a pitch. It breathes. Her words landed gently, unlike my sister's. There was no judgment in her eyes, only an invitation. I bought the scarf without hesitating. When she wrapped it and handed it to me, she said, "Wear it in good health." And for once, I believed the blessing was for me, not for the version of me others wanted. Walking home with the scarf tucked in my bag, I felt an odd lightness. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even confidence. It was something quieter, like the first inhale after holding your breath too long. That night, I tried on the scarf with an old blouse. I stood in front of the mirror, but I didn't look at myself with my sister's eyes. I tried to see myself with the same kindness the seller had offered me. The scarf rested gently on my shoulders, and I thought, this is what it feels like to carry something that does not argue with you. I wore it around the house the next day. No one saw me. There was no audience, no approval, no criticism. Just me, the scarf, and the rhythm of daily tasks, sweeping the floor, cooking rice, watering the plants. And yet, each movement felt subtly altered. I wasn't invisible to myself anymore. By the end of the week, I realized I had started humming again. I hadn't noticed when it returned, perhaps while washing dishes, or folding laundry. But there it was, a soft tune under my breath, unself-conscious, belonging to no one but me. It struck me then how healing doesn't always come with declarations or dramatic acts. Sometimes it begins with hibiscus tea, with a square of chocolate, with a scarf draped across your shoulders. Small, almost invisible victories. And yet, each one carved a little more space for me to exist on my own terms. The blue dress still waited. I wasn't ready to wear it. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it either. The invitation sat on the table for days, its neat lettering a quiet reminder that time was running out. My sister had dropped it off weeks earlier, her handwriting looping with that same precision she carried into every corner of her life. "It'll be a big evening," she had said, almost offhand. "Just wear something appropriate." Appropriate. That word had a way of hollowing me out. What did it even mean anymore? Appropriate to whom? To her? To the guests? To a family that had always drawn its lines so carefully, making sure no one spilled too far outside? I turned the envelope over in my hands, sliding my thumb along its sealed edges, and wondered how many times I had built my choices on the fragile scaffolding of that word. The days blurred into one another, each carrying me closer to the event. At first, I distracted myself with chores, scrubbing the tiles in the bathroom, rearranging books on the shelf, even polishing the wooden banister until it gleamed. But underneath each task lay the steady hum of anxiety. What would I wear? And, more than that, how would I carry myself once I walked into that room? I tried to reason with myself. It's just an evening. No one will remember what you wore in a week. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Maybe they wouldn't remember the exact shade or the cut, but they would remember the impression. And impressions, in my family, were treated as evidence. They became stories, retold at dinners, sharpened in retellings, until they sat like verdicts in the room. One afternoon, I pulled the blue dress from the wardrobe again. I held it up against the light, letting the fabric shift and fold. It was beautiful, not flashy, not scandalous, not wrong. Just beautiful. Yet I could already hear her voice, see the slight curl of her lip, the way her eyes would flicker toward others as though to say, "See what I have to deal with?" The weight of that imagined judgment pressed harder than the fabric itself. I set the dress down on the bed and stepped back. My hands trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the exhaustion of this endless calculation. I thought of the scarf I had bought, the way it had made me feel, the quiet relief of something that listened instead of argued. What if I paired it with the dress? Would it soften the sting? Would it let me feel like myself without drawing too much attention? I tried it. Draped the scarf loosely over my shoulders, let the fabric fall where it wanted. When I looked in the mirror, something shifted. It wasn't a transformation, no sudden surge of confidence or cinematic clarity. It was smaller than that, but steadier. I looked like a woman who had chosen her clothes for herself, not for the approval of others. And perhaps that was enough. But then the doubt crept back in. What if they laughed? What if the whispers started? I could almost hear the commentary, disguised as concern but sharpened with delight. Why that color? Doesn't she know better? My breath caught in my throat. I tore the scarf off and tossed it onto the chair. The mirror reflected my panic back at me, my face flushed, my eyes wild. I sat down heavily, pressing my palms to my knees. My body ached with the weight of 1,000 rehearsals, all the times I had played out these scenarios in my head, trying to find the version that would hurt least. I wanted to believe I was stronger now, that the scarf and the tea and the humming had rebuilt something in me. But here I was, trembling like a child before a door that hadn't even opened yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, the ceiling swimming above me. I thought of my grandmother again, the way she used to hum when she cooked, her soft voice carrying through the house. She had been criticized too, I remembered, for her accent, for her simple clothes, for her laughter that sometimes came too freely. But she had never bent fully. She had found small ways to resist, wearing her hair in the braid she loved, even when others told her it was outdated, refusing to give up her morning prayers, even when guests were waiting. She had been stubborn in her quiet way, and perhaps that stubbornness had been her salvation. The thought steadied me. If she could endure, maybe I could too. The morning of the event arrived with a heavy sky, clouds rolling like an unsettled sea. I woke early, though I hadn't slept, and made tea more out of ritual than desire. I dressed in plain clothes at first, just to feel the comfort of fabric against skin. But as the day wore on, the choice loomed larger. By afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister, leaving in an hour. I'll pick you up. No question mark. No courtesy. Just assumption. I stared at the screen for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed, "I'll meet you there," then deleted it. I typed, "I'll come on my own," then deleted that too. Finally, I placed the phone face down on the table and whispered to myself, "Not yet." I walked to the wardrobe again. The blue dress waited, its fabric rippling faintly in the draft from the window. I pulled it out, laid it on the bed, and sat beside it. My fingers traced the folds, the delicate stitching. I thought of the tailor I had passed in town, the hum of his machine, the way he had said clothes should sit where you breathe. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this dress was not a costume or a performance. Perhaps it was simply mine. I put it on. Slowly, carefully, as though each movement carried meaning. The fabric slid over my skin, familiar yet new. I fastened the pendant that had belonged to my grandmother, the chain cool against my neck. I draped the scarf loosely, not as a disguise but as a companion. When I looked in the mirror this time, my heart still raced. My breath still caught. But alongside the fear, there was something else, a steadiness, faint but real. I didn't look perfect. I didn't look like my sister. But I looked like myself. The sky outside darkened with the promise of rain. I slipped my feet into shoes that had molded to me over years, their scuffs a quiet testimony to the roads I had walked. I picked up my bag and the folded piece of paper I had written days earlier, the one that said I would choose what touched my skin, that I would not explain myself, that I would be kind if I faltered. I tucked it into the bag, a small talisman. As I locked the door behind me, I felt the old fear rise again. What if I fail? What if I crumble under her gaze? But beneath it, quieter still, was another voice, one I was just beginning to recognize. And what if you don't? I stepped into the evening air, the wind cool against my face, the scarf brushing softly at my shoulders. Each step toward the venue felt both heavy and light, like walking toward a reckoning I had postponed too long. And for the first time in years, I wasn't walking toward their approval. I was walking toward myself. The venue glowed like something untouchable. Strings of lights looped above the entrance, shimmering against the restless clouds. People drifted in, their clothes muted, their laughter tight, as though each sound was rehearsed. I stood at the edge of the pavement for a moment, clutching the strap of my bag, and let myself feel the old ache of hesitation. My feet wanted to turn back, to carry me home where the silence was familiar. But then I felt the scarf brush against my collarbone, soft and insistent, and I remembered the words folded in my bag. I will choose what touches my skin. I walked in. The hum of conversation wrapped around me immediately, broken by the occasional burst of laughter. Faces turned, not all at once, but in those quiet ripples that move through a crowd when something unexpected disturbs the surface. I could feel the weight of their eyes, measuring, assessing, filing away. My hands trembled, so I pressed them together gently, as if in prayer. And then I saw her. My sister stood near the center of the room, flanked by cousins, her posture precise as always. She was dressed in a beige gown that seemed tailored to erase her, to draw no more attention than a shadow. When her gaze found me, it was quick and sharp. Her smile faltered, just slightly, before she rearranged it into something neutral. But I saw it. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the flicker of annoyance that I had not bent as expected. She walked toward me, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. You came, she said, her voice even but tight. Her eyes traveled over the dress, the scarf, the pendant. That's bold. For a moment, I thought my knees might give out. The room blurred, the air thick with the threat of humiliation. But then I took a slow breath, letting it travel all the way down to where my stomach clenched. I lifted my chin. It's comfortable, I said simply. Not defiant, not apologetic. Just a fact. Her mouth opened, ready to reply, but something in my tone must have unsettled her. She closed it again, blinking. Around us, conversations had resumed, though I could still feel the occasional glance brushing against me like a cold draft. But I didn't crumble. I stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, letting her know I would not fill it with explanations this time. After a beat, she gave a small, tight nod. Well, let's go say hello to everyone. She turned, expecting me to follow as always. But I didn't move immediately. I let her walk 2 steps ahead before I followed at my own pace, my feet steady, my breath calm. It was a small act, almost invisible. But to me, it felt monumental. The evening unfolded in fragments. Relatives greeted me with varying degrees of warmth, some with genuine smiles, others with polite surprise. I could sense the questions hovering, unspoken. Why that dress? What is she trying to prove? But no one dared voice them directly. Instead, they lingered in the spaces between words, in the way eyes flickered too quickly away. At one point, my aunt leaned in and whispered, "You look nice." Her voice was soft, tentative, as though offering a fragile gift. I thanked her, my throat tight with gratitude, even if I couldn't tell whether she meant it or simply wanted to ease the tension. The food was served, the music rose and fell, and all the while I moved through the room with a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because I could still feel the sharpness of their judgment. Relief, because for once, I wasn't pretending. The dress was mine. The scarf was mine. The choice was mine. Later in the evening, my sister cornered me again, this time near the refreshments table. Her smile was fixed, her voice low so no one else could hear. "You know people are talking," she said. I sipped from my glass of water, letting the coolness steady me. "Let them," I replied. My voice didn't shake this time. Her eyes narrowed. "You always have to make things harder than they need to be." I set the glass down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table. "Harder for whom?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. For once, she didn't have a ready answer. She looked at me as though she didn't quite recognize who was standing there. And perhaps, in a way, she didn't. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. I turned and walked away, my scarf trailing lightly behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my feet as something solid, something earned. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I laughed once, genuinely, at a cousin's story. I ate food slowly, savoring it instead of rushing. I even stood near the music for a while, letting the rhythm move through me. And though the stares didn't stop, though the whispers never fully quieted, I realized they no longer pierced me the way they used to. They floated around me like distant static, no longer dictating the tune of my life. When it was finally time to leave, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky had cleared, stars peeking through the clouds. I breathed deeply, the fabric of the dress rising and falling with me, the scarf brushing against my arm. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt present. And in that presence, I understood something. I hadn't worn the dress to prove my sister wrong. I hadn't worn it to shock anyone or to demand attention. I had worn it for me, to remind myself that I had the right to exist in my own skin, without apology. It wasn't a victory, not in the way people like to tell stories. It was quieter than that. But it was mine. The house was silent when I returned. I closed the door gently behind me, as though not to wake something sleeping inside. The dress clung softly to my skin, the scarf resting at my shoulders, still carrying the faint scent of other people's perfume from the evening. I slipped off my shoes by the door and stood there barefoot, letting the coolness of the tiles steady me. The night felt unreal, and yet every detail of it pressed vividly against me. The glances, the whispers, my sister's narrowed eyes, they were all still there, but they didn't sting in the same way anymore. They were sharp, yes, but they no longer pierced me. It was as though the fabric I wore had become a shield, not because it was strong, but because it was chosen. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on, the same way I always did. The small hiss of water heating filled the silence. I leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly, and for the first time in days, my breath didn't catch. It moved freely, down into my belly, steady and sure. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water over the tea leaves, watching them bloom. I carried the cup to the table and sat, folding my hands around its warmth. The ritual was the same, but something inside me had shifted. This was no longer the tea of distraction or of swallowing shame. It was simply tea, and it belonged to me. I thought back to the moment near the refreshments table when my sister had told me people were talking. Her words had once carried the weight of commandments. But that night, they had sounded small. She hadn't known what to do with my quiet refusal. And maybe she never would. For once, that wasn't my burden to carry. It struck me then how much of my life had been built around trying to avoid embarrassment, not my own, but other people's. How often had I smoothed edges, softened my voice, dimmed my colors, just so no one else would feel discomfort standing next to me. I had thought it was kindness. But now I saw it for what it was, erasure, disguised as consideration. I took a slow sip of tea, the steam fogging my glasses. The warmth spread through me, and with it, a quiet sense of release. I had survived the evening. Not just survived, I had endured it as myself. And while that might not seem extraordinary to anyone else, to me, it was everything. I stood and went to the mirror in the hallway. The same mirror that had reflected my doubt days ago. Now it showed me something different. Not a woman transformed, not someone reborn, but someone returned to herself, to the space she had always deserved to occupy. I touched the pendant at my neck, feeling the roughness of the chain against my skin. My grandmother's voice echoed faintly in memory, a woman should not apologize to her own mirror. I smiled softly. Tonight, I hadn't. I undressed slowly, folding the dress with care, draping the scarf neatly over the chair. They were not talismans, not magic objects. They were just fabric. But they carried with them the memory of choice, and that made them sacred in their own way. I changed into a soft nightshirt and washed my face, the water cool and bracing. When I climbed into bed, the sheets felt gentler, as though they too acknowledged the shift in me. I lay there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the same sound that had once made me ache with loneliness. Now it was steady, like a lullaby of ordinary life. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from my sister, "You really do make things difficult." I stared at the words, the familiar sting of them. But then, slowly, I set the phone back down without replying. I turned off the lamp, letting the room sink into darkness. Her words could wait. They no longer dictated my nights. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought of the little paper folded in my bag, the one that said I would choose what touched my skin, that I would not explain myself, that I would be kind if I faltered. I realized I had lived all 3 lines tonight. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not bravely in the way stories like to tell it, but honestly. And that was enough. Before sleep claimed me, one thought rose clear and certain. I had worn the dress they told me not to, and the world had not ended. It had only begun to feel like mine.